In this video for Chapter 16, we're going to look at our wage setting and price setting model and think about what happens with improvements in technology and whether we should expect an increase or a decrease in the unemployment rate based on our model. So let's think about where we are, right? So new technology, right, should shift up our labor productivity curve, right? And that should, assuming that the profit rate stays the same, that should shift up our price setting curve. And so as we'll see when we look at the graph, that should both increase real wages and employment, meaning that the unemployment rate should decrease over time. And, with some caveats, right? Assuming that the labor force participation rate stays constant as well. So if we think about the adjustment gap, though, is sort of the lag, right, between some change in our labor market conditions and movement to that new equilibrium. And the diffusion gap is the sort of time it takes for that technology to spread throughout the whole economy. And so it's quite possible that even though our sort of long-run equilibrium of an increase in technology says we should have higher wages and higher employment, we might get a short-run outcome where we actually have less employment and higher unemployment. So if we just think about sort of where we are, right? So here's our basic model. We have our upward sloping wage setting curve. Output per worker is here in the dotted line, and then our real wage is the price setting curve here, and so here's our equilibrium. So now, if we increase technology, and assuming that our profit margin stays the same, we'll end up with a higher level of technology and a higher price setting curve. And so just taking that, at face value, we would expect a higher real wage and a lower unemployment rate. And so, hey, everything's hunky-dory. We move from A to B. Workers have higher wages, and we are hiring more people. Sounds great. The issue, of course, is that that movement from A to B might not be completely smooth, right? So one possibility is that we introduce a new technology. That new technology replaces a certain number of workers who get laid off. And instead of moving directly to B, we end up at D. And in this case, the wages are taking a while to adjust, and so they are the same. And the unemployment rate is actually higher rather than lower. Now, so what would we think would happen then? Well, now profits are quite high, right? So profits are actually higher than they were before because our new technology is allowing firms to produce at much higher levels, and they're still paying the same old wages. So we would expect more firms to enter. That would push us to E, and then because of the lower unemployment rate, that would push real wages up from E to B. So in the long run, yes, we do go from A to B. We do have higher wages and lower unemployment. But in the short run, we have this period of higher unemployment and higher profits. And so it looks like, in the short run that maybe workers are not benefiting from this new technology, right? And it takes a while for the labor market to adjust. And so the question is also, of course, does the wage curve shift, right? So this is looking at something called fair shares bargaining, where the idea here is that companies across the economy have to pay the same, work for the same pay for the same work. And so unions are able to increase their bargaining power, and so we get a shift up in our wage curve. If that's the case, then instead of coming to B, then we end up at C. And so in this case, we do have higher wages, right? Wages are always determined by our new price setting curve in equilibrium, right? Eventually, once we get there. But if we end up with that higher wage setting curve, then we actually end up with more unemployment. And so, you know, it's always tricky because some of these policies might be designed to protect workers, but we end up, with actually higher unemployment rates than we would without them, which is always, easy to say in the model, a little bit less easy to say in the real world. So if we think about sort of the difference between the long run versus the short run, right? The short run is where workers are experiencing getting laid off because of the new technology. We move from A to D. Employment goes down. The unemployment rate goes up. The wage share goes down because now there are higher profits and there's higher inequality. And certainly you could argue that this is one of the things that was increasing inequality, say, during the 80s and 90s in the United States. But then in the long run, because of those higher profits, we would expect more firms to enter. We moved from D to E and then eventually to B. So unemployment goes up, the unemployment rate goes down, the wage share goes back to where it was at A. And inequality goes down a little bit because of the unemployment rate being lower at B than it is at A. So we can see that here in our Lorenz curve where, at A, we have workers earning this amount and firm owners earning this amount. And then at D, we have more unemployed workers. And so the Lorenz curve shifts down and the Gini coefficient goes up. But once we get to B, then we actually have even lower unemployment rate. So now we have a slightly higher Lorenz curve, a slightly lower Gini coefficient than we did before. In the real world, of course, there's always so many things going on that, identifying the long run effects of increases in technology on things like the unemployment rate and inequality are extremely difficult because we have increases in technology, we have changes in trade, we have changes in education. All of these things are changing wages, changing employment, changing firm entry and exit. And so it can be very difficult to identify those effects in the real world. So the other question is like, all right, well, so if we move from A to B in the long run and wages go up and the unemployment rate goes down, then okay, great, that's what we want. But how long does that take? And remember what I said before is that the long run is one of those things where we never really get there. It's always an adjustment to different shocks, right? We're always getting shocks in the short run and adjusting to those shocks. So a lot of economists said in the 90s, hey, free trade is always good for people. We move from A to B in a similar type of way, right? You can sort of think of free trade as an increase in technology in a lot of ways. But what we saw is that especially when China sort of entered the World Trade Organization, it was such a large shock, right? They have so many workers that places in the United States that were competing with those industries ended up with pretty long-term consequences of lower wages, higher unemployment rates, and it's been taking a while for the labor market to adjust, right? People who have been working in an industry for decades and that lose their job, the firms go out of business, factories close. It could take potentially a generation for that labor market to fully adjust to the new reality. And of course, by the time that generation passes, we're in a whole different short run situation, which may be better or worse for those workers. So I guess the answer is that these things are extremely complicated, both to measure and to model, and it's not always clear what will benefit workers and what will hurt them. But even for a situation like an increase in technology that we're fairly certain does benefit workers in the long run, or at least always has benefited workers in the long run, we can still get these short run consequences that do not benefit workers.